Hey everyone, it's Dan and Don coming back to you from theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Once again, that website address is theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Today we are very fortunate and privileged and blessed to have Craig Lipset on. Craig, many of you guys know him from Twitter. They're involved in lots of things right now at Pfizer. He's the director of clinical innovations at Pfizer. And he deals with a lot of the clinical trials they have going on, and he's definitely going to talk to you guys a lot about, first of all, how he got started in research, a little bit about his career, and then some of the new innovative things Pfizer's doing with the help of Craig over there. So Craig, thank you for coming on.
It's great to be here. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome.
Thank you for coming. How was DIA, first of all? You just got back.
Yeah, it was pretty busy. I have to say, you know, I'm on the program committee. I'm actually chairing the program committee for 2012. So the DIA staff filled my calendar pretty well with planning meetings for 2012. I didn't get to catch too much of the 2011 content this year.
Okay. And I was always curious because I've never been to DIA, but Don just came from NCDU.
Mm-hmm.
Does Pfizer have a booth there, or like several booths, I would imagine, or one booth for each product they have, or how does that work?
You know, for the DIA, the pharma companies tend to only have booths if they're very actively recruiting for resources and R&D. Most of the exhibitors there tend to be vendors or suppliers to pharma around clinical research, and it's a pretty busy exhibit show floor, but mostly dominated by CROs and technology providers.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, Don just came back from NCDU. I don't know if you're familiar with that. What that
No.
is, the CNS. What is it exactly?
It's and I forgot what those acronyms stand for, but it is strictly for CNS. It's not near as large as the DI network meetings, but it's most of it is educational for the academics. But for us business people, it's a good chance for us to network and connect with the faces of the different vendors or pharma that we're working with.
Great. Well, certainly encourage you to come on out in 2012, June, Philadelphia, for the DIA's annual meeting. They'll have about 8,000 attendees for next year.
Yeah, maybe you ought to go to that one, Don, or we'll go together.
Yeah, definitely, because that's about 8 times the size of NCDU.
Great.
Yeah. But not to get too far off subject, what we want to do first, Craig, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for Pfizer.
Sure. So I've been at Pfizer now just about 4 years, and during most of my time at Pfizer, I've been involved in looking at tools and technologies from outside of the company and ways that we could or should be using those in how we're developing our medicines. I had worked in our molecular medicine group where I was looking at a lot of the different omics and health information technology platforms that could enhance our ability to develop precision or personalized medicines. Most recently, I worked in our corporate venture capital group where I was looking at technology investments, private investments outside of Pfizer. We have a venture fund of about $50 million a year. It's actually more of a budget of $50 million a year to invest in private companies that are interesting and important to the space in which we operate around healthcare. And now at Pfizer, in this role that we've called clinical innovation, really focused on looking at the tools and the methods that we could or should be able to introduce into clinical trials that could be potentially game-changing. A lot of these involve focus on data and how we're using data to be smarter than we have been in the past around how we're planning and executing studies, as well as a lot of work around patient engagement. I've been in clinical trials now for about 12 or 13 years. I've spent time at a CRO, at a clinical technology company, at a small venture-backed biotech company, and now at Pfizer, which is a fairly large company.
Yeah. What are the differences, I guess, between some of those organizations and Pfizer, and how innovative exactly, how difficult is it for a company like Pfizer to actually be innovative?
You know, it's a great question. I came to Pfizer, my orientation class at Pfizer when I first joined that week was larger than the entire small biotech company from which I had come. I had come from a 30-person company, and that week Pfizer hired more than 30 people alone. When I came in, I thought, you know, this is going to be a tricky place. I thought a large organization, 100,000 plus people, how much freedom to operate and create would we really have? What I learned about Pfizer actually has been really interesting. On the one hand, Pfizer as a company, as a culture, is very receptive to new ideas from within. It's not very hierarchical. It's not very segmented, where you might think that, gee, if that idea didn't come from a certain division or a person of a certain job title, that idea is not going to have merit. In fact, today we're very receptive to ideas from wherever they may come. I also think right now there's something of a perfect storm for innovation in companies like Pfizer. We have a sense of urgency as we've never had before. People are very sensitive and aware to the need to do things differently than we have in the past. 3 or 4 years ago, people were generally very comfortable and almost incented to do things the same way as they'd always been done. To look at the guy in the office next to you and say, if I execute the study the same way as that guy, I'll still have my job. Well, today we're seeing the changes. We're seeing sites closing. We're seeing new models. We're seeing a lot of our friends and colleagues no longer with the organization. And I think that's a very visceral change that people are feeling, and they sense that need to do things differently. But it's this perfect storm in that we have that sense of urgency, but we still have resources to do something about it. We still have the capacity to change the way we operate. And historically, we have not really innovated around clinical trials. We talk about being an innovative company, and we are in research, in the labs, when we're coming up with a new target or a new type of molecule to go after a mechanism, or maybe around a clever diagnostic. But the way in which we've developed those products really hasn't changed. And very often we feel it's because of the regulatory environment and the SOPs around which we have to operate. And we do, and there are a lot of regs, and they're important to make sure that patients are protected, that we're following our ethical and legal obligations. But all too often those are used as excuses for why we can't change things. There are other industries that are also very heavily regulated, and they've been able to demonstrate the ability to change. Today, we need to be able to show that same ability.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say a perfect example is social media. You know, it's very difficult, especially for an organization like Pfizer, to find the right balance when nobody yet understands the entire platform of social media. I mean, if you don't get involved early, and if you don't use it the right way, there's almost no point in using it at all. So there's no real half-assed way of doing it. And I think the same can be said for clinical trials. You know, there's a lot of opportunities there, but there is some risk there because there is the unknown and there's the whole FDA thing. So it's very difficult to balance the two.
You know, I think social media is a really interesting piece, and you know, in our industry, we like to talk about first starting with listening when it comes to social media, and I think that that's absolutely important, just to understand what vehicles are out there and how people are using them today. But I would say that today there are risks to not participating, and what I mean by that is, if you look at clinical trials in particular, and participants in clinical trials, participants in trials are social, just as patients today are social. They're out there and they're talking. And, you know, I sort of came about this realization, this epiphany in an interesting way. I was on a panel at a meeting at Bio around social media. And on the panel was a patient, a cancer patient. We were talking about how patients are using social media to find one another and how great that is for them, for the patients. At the end of this panel, the patient stood up. She said, you know, I'm sorry, I have to leave. I'm participating at the NCI in a clinical trial. And by the way, isn't this great? All the patients in the trial, we've been able to find each other in this online community and share our own observations and coach and support one another. And all of a sudden I had this light bulb that, well, of course, if patients are out there talking, so are the participants in our trials. They want to find each other. They want to share information about the studies and what it's like to participate. But the risks are that these patients are sharing information that affect the science and our ability to interpret those studies. So to me, that includes when patients are sharing information about eligibility criteria and potentially how to coach one another on how to meet subjective eligibility criteria. I'll give you an example, maybe an MS trial where only patients with a certain level of physical impairment are able to participate in the study. Well, patients who want to get into that study may coach one another on how to appear to have that leg issue or something.
Excellent point.
So these are important issues, right, that affect our patient eligibility. I can't blame the patients for wanting to get into these studies. If they want to get in, it's often because they feel they have very few other choices. But we know the patients are talking about eligibility. We know they're talking about observations that may suggest who's on active versus placebo. We're talking about safety signals. We can't stop those conversations from happening, but if we have our heads in the sand and ignore the fact that the conversations are happening, we run the risk of misinterpreting data that we're seeing in our studies.
We're definitely going to get back to this part about how these trials operate, and I know you had a lot of questions.
I did. What I want to talk to you about is what we again refer to as clinical trials in a box or virtual research. Can you tell us about that? Explain to the audience what that is.
Sure. So within Pfizer, we have been very actively monitoring a lot of the trends that we were seeing around healthcare. Trends around patient engagement in their own health, the rise of the e-patient, and the high number of patients that are looking for health information online. Trends around the quantified self, where patients are actively self-tracking their health state using tools like mobile apps or websites. Trends around remote patient monitoring and telemedicine, and certainly trends around health information technology and patients' ability to access and control their own health information. And when we were looking at those trends against how we did clinical trials today, against the trends out there that we see at Patients Like Me and other websites where patients are actively engaged as participants in research, we started to wonder about models to change how we conduct clinical trials and elevate that role of the patient really more as an active participant in our research model. What we were looking at is how today clinical trials are very investigator site-centric. We at the sponsor go out and find investigators for our study. Patients have to be in geographic proximity of that investigator site. They have to travel in and out of that investigator site. And what we were wondering was, using these new tools and this new level of patient engagement, could we make the patient more at the center and put the clinical trial around them, make it more accessible, more convenient to the patient? So as we began to socialize on this idea and talk more, we found some key opinion leaders out in San Francisco to work with and develop this model, brought in some technology partners, put some tools together, did a lot of tech integration, went and talked to the FDA and some IRBs, and we were able to demonstrate now with this particular pilot that we can, in fact, disrupt that model of how we do clinical trials and actively engage a patient as a participant, put them in the center, and make the patient able to participate entirely from home.
Mm-hmm. Is this the first time this is being done? Because I know you brought up the small organization in San Francisco. I think I know who you're talking about. But is Pfizer the first big pharma to do this, or has it been done before?
This is the first time that a clinical trial of a blinded randomized drug under an IND with the FDA is being done without physical investigator sites. We've done observational research in this way in the past, where we're not, say, randomizing patients and asking them to take an investigational drug. In the case of observational studies, we're more interested in natural history of disease, and in those cases we've been able to use this type of approach. But here we have a number of firsts, including that we're recruiting, we're screening, we're consenting patients all online, we're shipping them blinded study drug and all the tools that they need to participate from home, and then we're remotely monitoring their safety using telemedicine, using remote patient monitoring. And these are a number of firsts. I think we've seen some clinical trials in the past use pieces of these to try and reduce the burden of patients. As you know more than anyone, I'm sure, clinical trials are only increasing in complexity and burden of patients. So we've seen some effort to reduce the number of visits using some technologies, but this is the first time that all these pieces have been put together in this way, and that the trial is end-to-end without any physical investigator site interactions.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's definitely revolutionary there. Did Pfizer do this to cut costs, to speed up enrollment, to make studies run more smoothly, to get studies finished faster, or all of the above? What was the main reason for doing this?
I think the main reason was an appreciation that the way we do clinical trials today is largely unsustainable, that we can't afford to do all the studies that we would want to do and capture all the data we would want to capture with our current methods, and that we need more tools available to us, an arsenal of different approaches and methods that we can leverage to make it more efficient. And efficient to us, it is time, it is data quality, it is cost. You know, there's a lot of effort involved in setting up a lot of different investigator sites. It takes a lot of time. There's a lot of effort involved in monitoring all those different investigator sites. Now, this model obviously doesn't work for every clinical trial we're going to do at Pfizer, for sure. But certainly in some cases, we'll be able to use this model. And certainly in many cases, we'll be able to use pieces of this. So we actually consider this a series of modules that ideally we'll be able to use the modules in some of our conventional trials to help to reduce some of the burden and complexity for patients in those studies.
So just to get this clear, this was a phase 4 study, or I should say this is a phase 4 study. It's currently ongoing.
You know, because you guys are doing this with Detrol, an overactive bladder medication.
That's right. We're using Detrol LA, so technically it is a phase 4 study. To us, it's really a methodology study because we've already done the trials with Detrol to understand its efficacy and safety. The drug is very well characterized. For us, this study is an opportunity to validate these methods that we're using. And because we've done a lot of studies with Detrol LA, we understand its efficacy and safety, we have a lot of historical data against which to benchmark and to compare and to understand if these methods get us comparable data or if these patients are different in some way. And the data that we get back around efficacy and safety is different. And that's really what we're looking to understand here. Importantly, we did submit this, even though it is an approved drug, we did submit to do this study under the IND with the FDA, which opened up a great dialogue with regulators, got there, had the opportunity to really discuss and address any concerns the FDA would have about this approach.
Okay.
I was talking to some sites about this, and they're kind of scared. They're saying, well, you know, eventually they're not going to need us anymore. What is your response to these sites who are a little worried about this?
Don't shut your doors just yet. There's still plenty of need for investigator sites for many of the studies we have. And we have literally hundreds of trials ongoing at Pfizer today, from first in human to trials where we're really still looking to understand the molecule straight through to those larger phase 3 trials. And certainly we are going to continue to rely on investigator sites as partners to help us to understand how these drugs are behaving in the patients who have to participate. But as we all know, there often aren't enough investigators out there. We do have a defined shortage of investigators, according to researchers from Tufts and elsewhere. As a result, many of these trials end up leaving the country and going to other regions of the world. I would argue that there are plenty of patients in the United States and in other developed regions. We don't necessarily have to always travel the world to find participants for our studies. And so we're hoping that some of these tools will help to improve that engagement with patients. Certainly, the investigator community will continue to be an important partner for us going forward. In some cases, for very straightforward, self-reported, largely self-reported indications, this type of model gives us a new tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the, and I'm glad we got a chance to do this interview. One of the things I took away from your statement about 5 minutes ago when I asked you why did Pfizer choose to do this, and you said we didn't have the resources to do all the studies we wanted. So what I get out of that is you guys are not just slicing up the pie differently, but you're actually growing the pie because you're able to do the studies you were going to do anyways. but now you're just doing more studies because of this model. Am I right, or is that just wishful thinking?
You know, it's a world of limited resources. The pie can only be so large. And all too often we have to make difficult decisions about molecules that we simply can't afford to develop any further. Molecules that often have to be either out-licensed or sit on the shelf because you know, the cost of developing them simply doesn't offset, you know, the returns we may get in the future in terms of that ROI. So having more efficient ways to develop some of our medicines, I think, is an important part of making sure that we have a rich portfolio, a diverse portfolio of new drugs that we are able to bring through to the market, and hopefully enable us to make it a little easier to make some of those decisions on whether or not we can afford to develop some of these new products.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with this new way of approaching research, have you guys actually implemented it already? And if so, when did you start?
So we started about 18 months back the work around developing this new model, getting the protocol together, building the tools that were necessary, and making sure we understood whatever regulatory or legal issues we may run up against, either at a federal level as it related to our regulatory partners and responsibilities, as well as at a state level, where states are the ones who regulate the distribution of prescription medicines, as well as regulate telemedicine laws. So there was a fair amount of both technology and policy work that was needed to put these pieces together. But today we are open for enrollment in 10 states with this pilot. So this is actually live and ongoing.
And how's the enrollment? Has it been going pretty good?
You know, at this stage, that's also part of the learning. We have a dynamic engine in terms of being able to monitor different recruitment channels that we're using, be they conventional web-based ads such as Google ads or running an ad on a network like Facebook, but also looking at some of the more creative partnering that are available for us with patient communities or patient bloggers to be able to try and find patients. We've had a lot of activity on our website. We've had a number of patients who registered, who have consented and have participated in our initial screening phase.
Yeah, speaking of bloggers, there's a lady I interact with on Twitter. She runs the blog Bipolar Soup Kitchen. Her name is Stephanie, and she actually interviewed you on Twitter. And I'm going to ask, you know, one of her questions, I promised her I'd kind of expand. The way you guys monitor the safety in a real-time manner, can you kind of expand on that a little? Is there something new that you guys are using as far as the way the patients enter their own data? Would they use an iPad or iPhone or just a regular computer? How would they do that?
It's a great question, and certainly one of the fundamental questions here is our ability to demonstrate effective monitoring of patient safety in the studies. For this model, our patients have 24/7 access to the investigator, either over the web or through a phone. And by continuous and real time, what we're inviting patients to do is to submit any safety issues that they're finding in real time as they occur. There are no pre-scheduled visits that they have to sort of, you know, accumulate their concerns and share them with the investigator at a scheduled visit every month or 6 weeks. They're able to log in 24 hours a day or dial in 24 hours a day and report those concerns, and we're able to act on it and process it in real time, so that if there are safety issues, we're able to be very reactive and be very timely in reacting to those.
Yeah, that helps.
It's going to be an interesting, you know, because we've done other studies with Detrol LA with conventional safety monitoring approaches. One of the questions we're interested in seeing is, how do the safety data differ when patients are able to and encouraged to report them in this real-time manner as compared with patients in a more conventional study method?
Is the future of this new model and future trials that Pfizer chooses to do Is it based on the success of this study, or are you guys already convinced that this model can work?
I think we believe that certain modules will work, and we're comfortable going forward and looking for other places to introduce some of those modules. I think whether or not in whole this model will work, that's what this exercise is about. I think that some of it is certainly to show the technical feasibility, but I'm pretty confident the technology will work. We've tested very rigorously all the systems we're using. It really then comes down to whether the patient community is interested in this as an approach. And that's ultimately what we'll see. We read a lot about patient engagement. We read a lot about the numbers of patients that are online looking for health information. But are patients really interested in participating end-to-end in a trial in this way? I don't know, but hopefully we'll be able to learn, and we'll share the learnings as we find them.
Yeah, now moving on, I was reading a few years back that Pfizer was working on some kind of social media platform for patients out there. It was kind of like a Facebook for patients with clinical trials. Is there first of all, is there any truth to that? And second of all, I guess, is that part of the plan to integrate that type of social network with a study like this in the future?
So I think what you may be pointing to is an equity stake that Pfizer took in a product called Private Access a couple of years ago. So we did make an investment in Private Access, which is a company that's really focused on a universal privacy layer, the ability for patients to be able to actively control and authorize what aspects of their health information they want to share and with whom they'd like to share it. And we made that investment, and we've continued to explore opportunities with Private Access to use that platform in ways for patients to share health information around clinical trials, either in the context of patient recruitment or other ways that patients may want to be able to share health information to support research.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I didn't know the name of the company. So it's not like it's a Facebook social network type of platform. It's more of a place where patients can go and upload their medical records for their own purposes, and then choose to share what they want with certain organizations.
Right. It's really about that control over sharing aspect.
Very good. And that kind of leads to the e-patient. Can you talk to us a little bit about what an e-patient? First of all, what is an e-patient? And second of all, are you guys recruiting e-patients for this study, or are you just recruiting?
Sounds like they are.
Anyone?
The Pew Foundation broadly defines e-patient as patients that are online looking for health information. So I think there are a lot of different definitions out there. Others look at an e-patient where the E is more around empowered and around electronic, that, talking about patients that are active participants in their health and using information online to drive that, but where the electronic part is almost secondary to the fact that they are activated and empowered as patients. And certainly many patients with chronic disease for years have been e-patients. There's entire movements around AIDS and HIV where those were certainly very active and engaged patients, working in community long before there was, the internet for enabling that around health information technology. For this study, I would say that we are largely recruiting e-patients, regardless of the definition you're using. We're using mostly online channels to find patients, and the level of engagement that's needed to participate from home, we tend to be looking for patients that are very proactive in managing their own health and wellness. So regardless of which definition you're using, I would suggest that, yeah, we are pretty focused on e-patients as participants.
Yeah, well, with that definition, I'm an e-patient, because last night I was Googling heartburn remedies. So, hey, if I saw a clinical trial online recruiting, I would have clicked on that link. I really would have. But instead, I found some Alka-Seltzer.
Anything for relief at that time.
Yes, exactly.
What did you have for dinner last night?
It's chronic use of coffee. So it's like 5 years of just nonstop coffee, and it's catching up to me.
Yep, I told you.
That's some good, and that's the good stuff too. I like Dunkin' Donuts.
Okay.
You had a question about compensation, the way these patients would get paid, or?
Yeah, that's something we talked about. How are these clients compensated if they're not going into an office? But that's the other thing too. Reading one of the articles, you still have to have a PI involved in this. And is there any point in time they're going to have to leave their home and go into that office to see the PI?
It's a great question. So to the first point, we're very sensitive at Pfizer around patient compensation. We're happy to compensate patients in a fair way for their time, but we're very sensitive around the topic of inducement. And we tend to err on the side of probably much lighter on compensation than some people may like to assume out there. For this study, we are compensating patients for some of their time, and we're actually using a debit credit card, which is branded for the study. It's shipped to the patient, and we're able to automatically recharge that card at certain milestones, which tend to be when they've submitted electronic patient-reported outcomes via, say, the web platform or via a mobile app that we provide those patients. What's great about this card-based approach is it can be timely, so that they don't have to wait a week or 2 weeks or 4 weeks for somebody to cut a check and mail it to them. When they submit that data, if it's submitted on time, they get their payment, it shows up right on the card. So I think that's a nice approach. We absolutely still have a principal investigator for this study. To fulfill our obligations under GCP and other requirements, there is a principal investigator. It's just for this project, they're centrally located. So rather than being in geographic proximity of the patient, the investigator's in San Francisco and using technology to stay connected to those patients wherever they may be. The patient does have a blood draw. Actually, on more than one occasion, there's a blood draw. And what we've done for the blood draws is given the patient a few different choices. We ship them a kit, which happens to come from one of our partners on the study from Quest. And using the kit, they can either go to their own treating physician, but that may be a bit of an inconvenience, may actually cost the patient, have to pay them back. So that gets a little tricky. And much easier option is we can ship out a mobile phlebotomist to the patient's home. Wow. So we have a toll-free number. We'll send a phlebotomist to their home, do the blood draw wherever they like. For patients that aren't comfortable with that, because we're partnering with Quest, Quest has over 2,500 drop-in centers. They can show up at any Quest center with this kit, the bloods are drawn, and they're shipped from there straight to our central lab. So that from that point forward, the blood work looks like any other blood work in most clinical trials. It goes to a central lab, and from there the data is made available to us. But giving the patient a few different options around that. Some of the patients in the study will have a physical exam as well, and some of that is varied with state-by-state requirements. The exam isn't being done by the study investigator, it's being done by a local physician, and we've made arrangements, set up contracts to be able, with national physician networks, so that patients can very conveniently go in, have their exam as is needed, and that data is sent off to us so that the patient can continue to be randomized and participate in the study.
Quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, no wonder you guys are choosing to go with this model. It sounds extremely efficient. Any signs of the study completing enrollment on time so far? I know it's relatively new.
No, at this stage we've had to stage some of the state-by-state opening of the project. So we opened up very cautiously. We wanted to make sure the first few patients in, just that all the systems work. The patients got the box that they needed with all the supplies, that all the interfaces worked in terms of getting a phlebotomist, if that was the path, using the mobile tools that we were providing. And now what we're doing is we're adjusting the recruitment channels based on performance. So we're able to look and see in real time, how is one community delivering versus another? How is one online recruitment channel delivering versus another? And not just the number of patients that click through and land on our site, but really following to see, do those patients actually stick? Do they make it all the way and convert to an actual randomized patient? Because some online channels are very good at driving traffic, but they're not necessarily the right patient who wants to actually participate. And we don't want to waste anyone's time. Just having a site that causes a lot of clicks on our website isn't necessarily the right outcome.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we can definitely spend a lot of time talking about this study. There's lots of questions. As we wrap up, I'm glad I remembered. I was talking to someone in the industry, actually one of our CRAs, not related to Pfizer at all, but we were just talking about this article about this study, and she was curious about the consenting process. How do you guys ensure that the subjects understand what they're getting into?
Consenting is a great point. We have a few different paths that happen around consent. First off, the patients are able to receive the information in a number of different channels. They can read it. There's an audio version. There's multimedia. But the second step is there is a testing process to make sure that the information is understood by the patient, that they actually can grasp what we've tried to communicate. But importantly, we do have a phone call that takes place with the investigator, because we want to make sure that even with the testing, even with multimedia, that if the patient does have any lingering concerns, they know that there's an opportunity to have them addressed. We've inserted a sort of proactive phone call step so that the patient can't just click their way through.
Okay. Yeah, that way and I know you guys are taking caution with the compensation. But I mean, in every study, you're going to get people who do it strictly for the money. So I guess that's a good way to kind of control that, having that phone call instead of just letting them click their way through, like you said. So that's good. That's good. That was one of the questions we had. Anything else you'd like to ask, Don?
I think, again, as Dan said, we could probably talk about this all day long. There's a lot of, because working and running a investigational site, there's a lot of parts that come along with that, and we could sit here and ask those questions on each one of those all day long. Maybe that's something we ought to table for another time. But this is quite interesting. You're right. I know there are some other indications I don't see it working for when you're dealing with someone with schizophrenia, someone like that who's typically don't have access to a computer, and so you're not able to reach them that way, and not reliable to give you correct information unless you're dealing with a phase 1 study. Then you're dealing with a higher functioning individual. But when you're dealing with someone who's not as functional as a phase 1 type patient, then you might have an issue there. I can definitely see this working with a lot of medical studies.
No, I absolutely agree. It certainly doesn't is not a one-size-fits-all at all. You raised some interesting points about certain disease areas, and we have other initiatives ongoing to try and help us to develop objective measures, objective endpoints for many of these indications, because some of them, in particular in the neurosciences, are really difficult across multiple study centers to come up with good endpoints. And that's agnostic to a virtual trial or conventional or what have you. So there are other things that we have going on right now to try and to continue to innovate in this space, to look for new ways to measure endpoints, new ways to capture data, and make sure that we're in a position to use that data effectively, make decisions in a timely manner to keep these medicines developing, and ultimately, if they're safe and effective, get them through to the patients that need them.
And should the investigational sites also be looking at ways to change how they're conducting these studies as well, and submit that to pharma?
I'm certainly very receptive. I'm particularly, today I'm very interested in e-source and in some of the new initiatives for how to take advantage of some of the electronic health infrastructure and data infrastructure that many centers are starting to install. We're very cognizant of the fact that today there's a lot of redundancy for investigators, that our processes are not very investigator friendly. When you think about an investigator entering patient information into one computer, having to write down the source document on paper, and then entering it into our EDC system, that's hardly efficient for an investigator in their time. So making sure that we're both aware of that and looking for ways to make that more efficient while we can still demonstrate the compliance that we need to.
Yeah, no, this is great stuff. We're definitely going to have a part 2 follow-up later on down the road and see how this study is progressing. This is Craig Lipset. If you want to follow him, his Twitter handle is at Craig Lipset, like his Lipset. And are you still blogging, Craig?
I was quiet for a while. Now that I'm in this new role and back in R&D, I'm going to pick that up again. We have a site at Pfizer, actually, science.pfizer.com, where a number of folks from research are actively blogging, and I've started picking that up again as well.
Yeah, very good. Just another example of brands getting involved in the content game. And I mean, Pfizer's the biggest one, so if they can do it, a lot of other people certainly can too. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
And we're definitely going to have you back on again soon, okay?
Thanks, guys. Keep up the great work.
Thank you
very much.
This is Dan and Don signing off from theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Thanks a lot.